Um, Thank you for joining us for the first official panel for Kopano 2019. I must say that I feel like I've been thrown into the deep end. Usually I get the graveyard shift. There's a different pressure that you feel when you moderate the first panel for a gathering such as this. Perhaps in terms of what you outlined around the toilets, Kane, and that the gender neutral toilets are a level above us, if the other foundation can perhaps think about making that up to the trans and gender diverse community by perhaps making hormones accessible to us during this convening. That's one way. um, So yeah, in terms of looking at the panel or at the program, I'm just going to run you through the structure of the program or the structure of the time that we're going to be allocating to this panel. So we've got about 1 hour 20 minutes that we're going to be engaging around the topic of SADC. Is there sufficient political will to advance, and in this particular instance, advance a particular LGBTI human rights agenda across Southern Africa, and using SADC as a mechanism to be able to achieve that. So for the first 35 minutes, we are going to be engaging with the panel, or I'll be engaging with the panel. And then subsequent to that, there's going to be another 35 minutes allocated for engagement from the floor for everybody to then fully engage with the content that has been presented by the panelists. And then subsequent to that, we're going to go into a 10-minute closing session through which the panelists will be given an opportunity then to just share their final remarks in concluding the conversation for now. So on the panel, I've got Tashwa Esterhazen, and Tashwa Esterhazen is from the Southern African Litigation Center and currently working within the LGBTI Human Rights Program as it concerns litigation across Southern Africa. We also have Dr. Pitso, that's from SADC, the Southern African Development Community, and will be representing the Secretariat. We have Glenn Farrett from SADC as well, speaking in the capacity as a representative from the Council of NGOs, which is also inclusive of churches and trade unions, from what I understand. And then last but not least, we've got Steve Litsike, that's from Access Chapter 2, that is also an LGBTI focused organization based in South Africa, and then also very strategically placed within the structures of the South African National AIDS Council. I've asked the panelists to also share with us within this particular space things that they want us to know about the work that they are doing currently and how it relates to the current theme or topic that we will be discussing during the course of this session. So Tashwa, if we can start with you, yeah, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. Is my mic on? I'm very excited to be here. It's my first Kopano, so thank you for the other foundation for inviting me. So yeah, as Liberty said, I work for the Southern African Litigation Center. So SALC is a regional organization, and we work throughout 10 Southern African countries, where I run the LGBT and sex worker rights program. So I'm a lawyer by training, but I call myself an activist lawyer. And that, for me, is very important because it's that every strategy that we do throughout the litigation, and many of our partners are in the room, Kane, NRA, TBZ, it's very important for us that the strategy is driven by the activists themselves. So for me, that's why I feel like we would not embark on the litigation unless the activists is in. We have community consultations for them. Are they on board with the strategy? So that's why I feel like litigation should be spearheaded by the activists themselves. And just what the recent litigation that we see in Botswana, for instance, is an example of activist-driven litigation. And now people would, for instance, say that, wow, but Botswana, I heard our gentleman from Nigeria mention earlier on that people are softer in Southern Africa, but that didn't come from nowhere. It came from activists who became visible and asserted their space. Kane, we always joke about with Kane for the longest time, Kane took it upon himself to be the only known homosexual in Botswana. But that created visibility and a space for LGBT people to exist. And it moved towards along that similar visibility, moved to what we saw on the 11th of June. So yeah, that's an introduction of myself, and we will talk about it more as the time goes on.
Over to you, Doctor.
Good morning, everyone. Like I was introduced, my name is Joseph Pizzo. I am currently the head of gender unit in the SADC Secretariat. And I am here to be part of this discussion because I've been in the concept that I used here, I can say that I've been an ally for a long, long time in terms of really trying to understand the plight of the LGBTI people. I happen to have taught this gentleman at the university, and I was telling even his friend that he is the first person in Botswana that I saw, being very, very clear about who he is and what he wants. And he was my friend, he can attest, he will tell you more, that as his lecturer on issues of gender, sexual and reproductive health and rights and issues like that, he used to engage me more than any other because he was even teaching me things that I should actually put in the curriculum. So, but I'm here not for that. I'm here to basically share with you maybe the mechanisms that can be used to engage SADC, because as you know, SADC is diverse and has a very different people with different views about issues of LGBTI. That is obviously emanating from the historically imposed male-female binary that is still very predominant in our region. So basically, this is what I'll be discussing with you. Thank you.
So hi, my name is Glenn, and I am the Executive Director of the SADC Council of NGOs. The SADC Council of NGOs was established in 1998. It has an official memorandum of understanding with the SADC Secretariat, and that means that it is recognized as a non-state actor within the architecture of SADC. We represent 15 national coalitions with 2 exceptions. I'll make that 3. One is the Union of the Comores. The other is Namibia, if there are any Namibians in the house. Good. And then, of course, South Africa, which is always a special case in everything that we do. Brings its own challenges and opportunities. And those national coalitions are made up of NGOs who work in a diversity of areas. We also have what we call regional thematic networks, so people working on disability, people working on health, people working on environment, human rights, mediation, governance issues. And then we have a very complicated relationship with the Southern African Trade Union Coordinating Council, SATUC, which represents workers, of course, and the Fellowship of Christian Councils in Southern Africa, which represents the church. And together we host something called the Civil Society Forum, which we had now recently outside this official summit of the heads of state and government. And our mandate is essentially to facilitate the well-being of non-governmental organizations, and then to assist and facilitate the engagement with SADC institutions, processes, decision-making. And we come here with a high degree of shame. So let's just get that out of the way. As an organization which hosts and convenes the Civil Society Forum, we have backtracked on the issues that you are strategizing about. So let's get that up front. Because we operate on the basis of consensus and general agreement with our partners in the trade unions and the churches, unfortunately, we have not been able to find the language, the voice, the strategy, the methods to take forward and raise this flag as we should. And I think for that purpose, I'm really here to learn and engage with you as to how we can better do that.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Steve Litsike. I'm with Access Chapter 2. I do have a couple of hats, that I think part of the discussion will reflect on. I am the chairperson of South African National AIDS Council's Civil Society Forum, and also the co-chair of the Commonwealth Equality Network, which consists of 53 members from 48 countries within the Commonwealth states. But I think particularly for this discussion, and thanks to the other foundation for the invitation, there's quite a lot that we need to do, and it's an interesting era in SADC, but also in Africa as a whole. The era where we have Resolution 275, which must be promoted and be implemented accordingly by member states, but also we're seeing quite a lot of progress in countries, Angola, Botswana, Mozambique, Mauritius, but also some of the issues, can also easily be clouded by political dynamics. But in terms of what is the meaning of implementing programs that takes care of the livelihood of LGBTI persons and gender non-conforming persons beyond violence. And I think we really need to go beyond the narrative of violence, but also the narrative of livelihood, both socioeconomic livelihood of LGBTI persons and gender non-conforming persons. And I think our governments have that responsibility, as we have agreed on the SDGs, agreed on the AU 2053 agenda, and also the SADC development plan. How do we advance the socio-economic livelihood of LGBTI persons?
Thank you, everyone. I think in terms of looking at political will and political will within the context of SADC in itself as a political structure, looking at some of the other priorities that's currently being prioritized, and assumably at the expense of a human rights agenda that is supposed to be advanced and in relation to LGBTI persons in this instance. And this question is perhaps directed to you, Dr. Pitso and Glenn. How would you situate this current concern that we have within the political structure that is SADC and the political will that exists to advance?
Thank you. They want me to start. It's a very difficult question because, like I said during my introduction, that political will is something that is very tricky to actually discern and measure, in the sense that sometimes individuals, depending on where they find themselves, they would like to sound politically right by using the same language that they're expected to use. But for me, I always try to draw the dichotomy between activism and professionalism, in the sense that what I see within the context of SADC, especially on issues of political will, not only on issues of LGBTI, but even on issues of maybe poverty alleviation and so on and so forth. There's a question of whether you are authentic about what you are saying. I can give an example that I participate in SADC. I participate both in SADC Secretariat, and to a large extent also I work with SADC Parliamentary Forum, with regional women parliamentary caucus. Some of the people here are members. And you would find within these legislators that there will be maybe 3 people who are really, really vocal about issues of LGBTI. I have in mind here one minister and also MP from Botswana, so that irrespective of what is being discussed, she will always try to make her colleagues realize that the plight of the LGBTI should be put on the table. But moving away from that micro to macro, we should also understand how maybe SADC Secretariat operates. That is, SADC Secretariat is a REC, Regional Economic Community, which is basically a building block of the community that is called African Union. And therefore, some of the things that even if you look at our region, like speaker who spoke from Nigeria was saying, yes, when we go to African Union and we discuss these issues of even the concepts of sexual reproductive health and rights, you would find that other regions, they are not even, comfortable with the word rights. They want to say sexual reproductive health and reproductive rights, thus excluding the sexual rights and things like that. And as a building block, it means sometimes we have to really look at the entry points. Yes, the entry points is always our member states, where you have a concerted effort of people actually convincing, their countries that when you go there in this platform, this is how you should actually be working. But basically what I'm trying to say is that it's a shame right now that we were in New York in March, approving the African Union gender strategy. It has the best language ever. Those 4 pillars, when you look at it, we have leadership, voice and visibility, you have dignity, security, and resilience, you have maximized opportunities, and these are beautiful words, but when you read in them, they are hollow in terms of, excluding the people that should be there. We talk about the SDGs and also leaving no one behind. But basically what I'm trying to say is that it's very, very difficult for me, given the time, to actually, say there is no political will or there's political will. What I can speak to is basically to say, yes, we have overarching instruments, like we have SADC protocol on gender and development, and it will be talking about even addressing emerging gender issues and concerns and things like that. I came at a point when I joined SADC, I was from UNAPA, where I was a gender specialist. And, the question I asked to the people that were there was to say, in these gender issues, concerns, and do we have issues of the LGBTI? They were saying, we can't even start there because there are so many issues that we're dealing with here to deal with the women empowerment and so on and so forth. But when you look at, for instance, in 2018, we published a strategy on HIV/AIDS treatment, prevention, and care, and sexual reproductive health rights among key population. We have a strategy there, and you look at it. It has the language, but as to implementation of some of the issues that we are raising here is another thing, because I must also buttress the fact that SADC is so, we usually come up with, as Secretariat, where the think tanks, we come up with overarching strategy. And it's for member states now to implement what is in the strategy by contextualizing it and so on and so forth. And like he was saying, that we work, through this concept of consensus. A country can take it up, others can just ignore it, and so on and so forth. There's no one who will whip you or coerce you to actually do the needful. And so that means that you now have to cascade down and from the grassroots be the ones to actually saying, you are a party to this, what are you doing about it, and so on and so forth. Because as Secretariat, we are really secretaries. We document, we bring ideas and so on and so forth. But it's for member states to actually who come there through Council of Ministers, through Summit of Heads of State and Government, to actually now do things happen and make things happen. So basically, I'll stop there, and then I will interact as we go along. Thank you.
Yeah, just to build on what Dr. Pitso is saying, the Secretariat can only do what it is mandated by the heads of state to do. So just get that very clear. And who are these member states? They are your governments. Yeah. So to your question of political will, if we were to assess it within the Secretariat at a technical level within member states, there is a significant level of understanding and sensitivity towards this community, I would say, from years and years of work, from different areas of work that governments implement. So beyond that, when we look at the political level, when you come to this question of where's the will, there are really only two positions that we have discerned within SADC. Okay, so before I go there, let me explain something very briefly. That SADC is not what you think it is. It's not a normal REC. It's not a normal regional economic community. SADC is an abnormality in that it is preceded by something called the frontline states. And if you recall the mandate of the frontline, giving away our ages here, but those of you who recall the mandate of the frontline states, not pointing out at anyone, Botswana, Tanzania, Zambia. And their mandate was simply the end of apartheid and colonialism in Southern Africa, the right to self-determination for all our peoples. And that gives SADC a very unique identity. That on the one hand, it has a formal treaty. SADC exists by international law. It's an intergovernmental organization. It has a treaty, and then it has a secretariat, and then it has agencies, and it has structures, and all these things. And it has two levels of that. One is the general, and then there's what we call the organ. Please note the masculinity of the language. The organ on politics, defense, and something else, security. Yes, that one. Okay, so SADC is also a mutual non-aggression pact. And that means that if any member state in Southern Africa was to be violated in any way, that the other members are bound to come to the defense of that member state. Please follow this logic very carefully, because it will explain what I'm about to say. So while SADC has the outward appearance of a regional economic community, like the European Union or the African Union or ECOWAS or IGAD or any of those others, it also has another identity which is not so secret, that it is a political club. Okay? It's a political club of the national liberation movements. Please shake your hair if you're from a national liberation movement. No? Okay, we're not doing that. Okay. So those national liberation movements are not disorganized. They may govern you in a disorganized way, but they are not disorganized. And they are Frelimo, MPLA, CCM, ZANU-PF, SWAPO, BDP, and the ANC. Okay? That's the club. That's the club. So if you want to know what SADC's political attitude is, you need to follow the political attitude of the club's members. And ZANU-PF and SWAPO have managed the playbook on LGBTI. Okay? So internally, their attitude is simple. We are completely neutral on this issue. We are completely neutral on this issue. Take that as you will. They are neutral. We will not be drawn on this issue, save when it is necessary to deal with social and political unrest. So the playbook is simple. When a government, and when I say government, please understand, I mean a party. When a party feels itself under threat, you are the first target. So those of you who recall back in 1998 the comments of the late, great Robert Gabriel Mugabe in respect of lesbians and gays, do you remember that? Okay. So that's the first line of assault. The next is the media, then the judges, then like that. So, okay? So this is how it works. This is, if I feel uncomfortable, if I feel unsettled, I need to other people. I need to make someone a scapegoat, and I start with the easiest target, the least understood, the most marginal, the most vulnerable, the easiest to scapegoat. So when you see these things happening in a country, they are orchestrated in response to other dynamics. So while in a formal sense, the attitude is neutrality, for expediency purposes, the attitude is hostility. For expediency purposes, the attitude is hostility. Now, I might be being unfair. This might not be what those national liberation movements would admit to, but we've seen it consistently play out. So if something keeps on happening in the same way, we have to ask, hang on, are you guys not sharing the same script? And the answer is, yes, they are. So that is your program indicates that you have a high level of awareness of these dynamics. So the things that you are going to be addressing over the coming days should help you answer some of how we respond. But I would say again that at a technical level, there is space. At a member state level, there is space. Within SADC Secretariat, there is space. But the broader political question is just that. It's a political question.
Thank you for that very detailed analysis, Glenn. And I saw you nodding your head a number of times, Steve. So I don't know if you want to add something to the content that Glenn has shared now.
Yeah, well, thanks, Liberty. I think there are quite a number of things we need to think about. You know, over a decade ago, many of SADC member states or head of governments came together and they came out with a language that says we want shared responsibility, shared accountability, also for inclusive SADC community. And it's a very important language. And I think maybe also many of our governments are very good with language and very bad with implementation. And I think we've got that everywhere, even here in South Africa, 25 years in democracy, but we are way behind in terms of what implementation must look like. And I think we are also lost in this recent language of all. You know, when we're saying leaving no one behind, when we're saying human rights for all. But when you look at from the community we come from, you must actually interrogate what all means. Because when you interrogate what all means in the context of heteronormative systems, now education, it has a heteronormative system. So you have to unpack. So those who work in the education sector must start to unpack what the system has been shaped, what the dressing code in the education system looks like, and so forth. So I think we are challenging that kind of narrative on how you unpack that, whether what's in the curriculum also, and I think also I do think there are quite a number of changes, and I mean, we work a lot with governments, with political leaders who have a will. Now, there's one aspect where you have individuals who are occupying the space of leadership who have a will. But there's something else when a government has a will. Are we asking for state will, where there's transformation completely that must happen, where there's clear intentions of giving instructions of inclusive agenda? Now, in the context where we're saying inclusive agenda, and I remember a few years ago, and I hate this example, many of our heads of government flew to America to meet one president. So this is the US Africa Leaders Summit. I don't know why did the one president from America could not fly here, so we took the costs and all our presidents flew to America to meet one president. Now, what is the issue there? There's an agreement that many of our governments have, which is called the AGOA agreement. Now, I've raised the issue of economy or socio-economic. AGOA agreement, which is an agreement between the US and African countries. Now, there's some issue in this. Now, for us as South Africa, where we're still discussing the land issue, yeah? Why was Trump strong in writing saying that you cannot touch the land. There's a clause that says you will not touch the private property. And private property that belongs to who? Right? So why I'm bringing this up is that even in the context of different clauses that says protect human rights, but you will not protect human rights for all. You would actually be selective because the clauses that are not agreed, that are very prescriptive and intentional, will be then the gap. Now, in the context of shared responsibility, if we do not make sure that the clauses are clear and they are prescriptive for LGBTI community, for gender non-conforming person, we are not able to achieve actually what we want to see. Now, I think Tesho raised the issue of using litigation. And I think, when you look,
that, yes, as well.
yeah, there are three things. The state, any member state operates, particularly in SADC, they've got arms of states. Yeah. So you've got judiciary, you've got parliament, which is playing an oversight, and then you've got the executive. And I think it's very important for us to understand the context of using all elements, because if you only use one space, you are holding on. Of course, protection is in the law, and that's what we want. We want the law to be very clear, to be very protective, but not only protective, only just on stipulating what those rights are, but enforcing the very same law. So when we say human rights, and you've got the right to privacy, the right to freedom, the right to equality, actually, many of our countries must be taken to court, because by virtue of saying the right to equality, freedom, and the right to non-discrimination, even if you don't prescribe sexual orientation and gender identity, those are the contexts that you can still fight dignity and integrity of individual. But similarly, what is the role of parliament? I don't think our parliaments are doing so much to play their oversight role. And I'll give you an example. We have an issue of gender-based violence in South Africa. It's a huge epidemic. In 2008, when we submitted a shadow report, South Africa submitted a 10-year report, 98 to 2008. Civil society submitted a shadow report. CEDAW made recommendations to this country. In recommendations were very clear: develop a national strategic plan, ensure that you set up a council that will play an oversight, address the hotspots, look at the root causes. So some of these recommendations that were made over 10 years ago, they're still not done. So whose responsibility is this? And these recommendations were to Parliament. So by the time they come to SADC, what has all these key stakeholders played in their role, besides just implementation? So I do think when we say political will, to some extent we can say political will in the context of probably president, ministers, but really by far of creating change. The political will must come from the bottom, which are those very same councillors, mayors, who are implementing. So what you see a very big gap of what is right and what is said in a right way. So the political will, you will feel it from national leaders. Even the Zimbabwean president, Emerson, spoke recently and included LGBTI. So you can hear there's some sort of change of somebody speaking out. But whether will that result in access to service, will that result to access to opportunities, that will not happen. So there must be ways where we look at political will, shared responsibility across spectrums of different spheres.
Thank you, Steve. You want to add to that as well?
I also think that perhaps we shouldn't think SADC as this tribunal that's here and then without the member states. Because at the end of the day, if the government is hostile towards LGBT in your country, they're going to have a similar approach regionally. So the work actually starts within our own country. Public visibility, the engagement with government starts from the ground up, and that's how when activists, when the governments come in at a SADC level, they can have a different change in attitude. So we shouldn't see SADC as this, hopefully we can go stand with placards and campaign, because if they were hostile to within your country, why do we think it will be different at the SADC level? And also, I think perhaps I've been thinking about this. We should, as a community, perhaps also think about how do we move out of our silos as an LGBT community. Because SADC believe in, for example, I'll make an example, they have all these SADC principles on democratic governance, elections, and whatever. Do we actually engage when they're actually going to submit those principles? As the LGBT community, do we actually go and get involved to make sure that they actually said that we want the democratic governance of the country to respect the rule of law? This has nothing to do with LGBT. To respect freedom of expression, to respect an independent judiciary. And they must put mechanism in place to make sure how the judiciary's independence are respected. These are important democratic governance regardless of whether you're LGBT, and that's the role of SADC. We can deal with LGBT later because it's a long-term objective. But for now, what we want is we want democratic principles in place in all countries that the government must adhere to. For example, if we don't have these democratic principles in place, for me as a litigator, as a lawyer, I can litigate until I'm blue in the face. But if we don't have an independent judiciary who actually believes in upholding the rule of law, then it's futile. Then we don't have to litigate. Yes, we can litigate because sometimes people say we're losing forward or we're losing backward, but it's not going to change because the judiciary is not independent. So we need to make sure as activists, how do we get involved in those principles? That even it's not about LGBT, because remember the judiciary is about everyone in the country. Having an independent judiciary and respecting the rule of law, the example for South Africa in the al-Bashir case, there are many other cases where South Africa has not been respecting the rule of law, but that was blown out of proportion where where it was shown how South Africa the government was actually in our face, they were not respecting the rule of law. How do we get involved as LGBT activists to show that we want to make sure that the rule of law in this country is being protected? Because if we don't get involved in that, when an LGBT issue, what do we think if the government doesn't care about foreigners, nationals? The xenophobic attacks that happened recently in South Africa. And the government is not saying anything about it. How do we actually are convinced when we go about the LGBT issue that they're going to listen to us? So we have to understand the intersectionalities, but not only with regards to the sort of issues with regards to women and children, etc., but the broader governance issues. Does the constitutions protect the actual, are we getting engaged with the constitutional process, not only to include sexual orientation in the constitution, but to make sure that there's an idea of respecting constitutionalism. And that means respecting the constitution. And I think we should perhaps as a community think, how do we actually get involved in broader governance, SADC governance issues besides our silos, LGBT, that relates to us? Because all of this relates to all of us.
Thank you, Dashwa. I think in terms of some of the sentiments that have been shared by the panel, one thing that has also stood out for me has been this unholy alliance between economics and political relevance in country and how it translates into human rights outcomes or human rights realizations for different marginalized communities. And also, as you outlined, Steve, there's the way in which we interpret all within our policy framework. There's a very particular way of how we interpret that, which is generally speaking through a heteronormative and of course a cisnormative lens, and those all tie up into how our political structures then relate to issues around gender just generally. And it's not isolated to LGBTI persons, it's also isolated, includes cisgender women in particular, and the relationship that we have for meaningful inclusion and meaningful participation with the opportunity to affect broader change. In terms of looking at some of the sentiments that you shared, Dashwa, around the doctrine of separation of powers, to have the three spheres within a democratic society being fully functional, you've been quite involved within strategic litigation as one component of the work. Can you perhaps just speak to how that has also contributed to shifting the public in a particular way or political will in particular countries that you've worked in, but also the two cases of Angola and Mozambique, where it wasn't necessarily strategic litigation that has led to reform, but it was political will in a different way that has led to that reform. Can you perhaps just speak to that? Yeah.
Yeah, I think with regards to like I'm going to talk about Botswana as an example. I do think public activism and throughout the years has led to strategic litigation being successful. But the activist was also very, and Steve was mentioning about how engaging with the government. And the activist, with every litigation that was embarking in Botswana, the activist was very strategic of how to engage with the government. And so they've actually used all that processes. And it's only when those processes have failed that they've turned to the court. And Kane can mention to you that like we would write to the government and say, can you do this? There will be a response, and there will be no. But they went through all those engagement processes because LGBT is such a sensitive issue, activists had to do more work than what you would do in other litigation. So you had to now literally go the extra mile. And when it came to the time when it came to, for instance, by the time it came to the litigation proceedings, one could demonstrate to the court what we've tried every single possible avenue, including engaging with the government. And now it's up for the court to come to intervene. And that have worked very successful. With the court was saying, well, what must I now do? Because I'm here, the guardian of the Constitution. And the activists have tried every single thing possible, and now you have still thrown your hands up in horror. So what must I not do? And that's the only time that the court have said, I'm going to step in. Because you have failed in your duty, I have no other responsibility but to step in. Because we all understand the court has their roles and they shouldn't step in government's role where they shouldn't. But if the activists have shown through annexures in court documents, showed that everything possible has been done. And this is where I think as activists we should, and I love what Legebiba has done with regards to their long-term strategy with litigation. Like every single thing that they actually that they've been doing, they always think that this might end up in court. So how they engage with the government is in a way that they almost set the government up without the government knowing. So they basically attach, we've done this, we've done this research, and we want to engage with you. All of these are engagement processes. With the evidence that Legebiba submitted in the Decrum case was done, and the court heavily relied on that evidence to demonstrate how the laws negatively impacted LGBT people. But this evidence was done long before the actual litigation. So this is what is seeing that the strategy is actually very long term. Even the public visibility. Botswana was a very different country 10 years ago. You wouldn't even dare, like when Kane brought that first registration case in 2000, Kane, when was that? Many years ago. But I mean, when Kane brought that first litigation case, one would never even imagine that it's going to go ahead. In fact, the first case was withdrawn because we were not thinking that the courts were not there. So all of these stuff it was actually public, and that's why I love creating this space theme of the conference. And also, for instance, many governments have these national AIDS framework. And there they talk about LGBT, and they talk about MSM, and they talk about all these things. And in the Botswana case, the court actually said, well, it's disingenuous. And this is how you can sort of set the government up without knowing that it's a long-term strategy. Because you now only negotiate about the national AIDS framework. We're not talking about litigation. But we are negotiating LGBT people are vulnerable to HIV. We need to include them. But they don't know we're actually going to use that later against them. To show to the court, well, the government has included us in the National AIDS Framework, they cannot now say that we don't exist. So every single thing that we need to do, we need to think about what is the objective that we're trying to achieve from here. So, and again, we were lucky in Botswana because the judiciary is very independent. And if you want to use litigation, you have to have an independent judiciary. And therefore, it relates to the SADC, and how SADC has to consistently put the measures in place. We need to engage with Cyril and say to him, well, there's not enough independence. The way the judiciary is being elected is not independent enough.
Perhaps in terms of you've touched a lot on the Botswana case, and I think that there are two critical precedent-setting endeavors across the region, which is in Angola, that decriminalize same-sex consensual sexual conduct with I think 155 to 1 vote in favor of decriminalization, and in Mozambique, similar process. Can you perhaps speak to the context within those countries?
I wasn't very actively involved in both Mozambique and Angola, so I think perhaps during the question and answers session, we can just ask Danilo to provide some input on that, if that's okay.
Danilo opening his eyes wide. Can think about it, Danilo.
But,
Steve?
Liberty, I think we also need to be careful because not all the national strategic plans in SADC member state specifically indicates LGBTI. I think from what Joseph had indicated, many of the countries have integrated key populations.
Yeah.
One, we have to recognize SADC, it's in the heart of the highest, HIV incidence, because sub-Saharan South Africa has a high rate of HIV prevalence, and which we know, of course, majority of people living with HIV are here in South Africa. We've got 7.9 people living with HIV, 7.9 million people living with HIV. And many of the countries, if you look at, whether you're talking Botswana, you're talking Angola, or you're talking Malawi and others, the incident rates or prevalence rates between 7 to about 13% of the population. And I think that's the biggest issue that we need to worry about. But many of the countries have integrated key population, which is a spectrum of men who have sex with men, and other countries don't recognize trans population in their response, while we know transgender women are 49 times higher of contracting HIV than any adult of reproductive age. So what we know is what has been included. South Africa is actually the only country that has developed the South African LGBTI HIV plan. And this was led by government, and this was launched by government 2 years ago. So others do indicate targeted intervention for person. Why I'm saying we need to be careful, and while I'm one of the lead and very clear activist in terms of advancing the agenda from a public health point of view, if you look at how HIV response is shaped, so from vulnerabilities itself, it's solely addressing the behavioral perspective. Now, it actually removes the idea of identities. So you're not talking social and structural vulnerability that HIV has as an entry point. So there's very limited work. But if you look at the SADC HIV strategy, which is very clear on what are the things that needs to be addressed. You need to address social structural behavior and biological elements, so which brings in the gender context. So I really do think it's important to think about other spaces which many of us, people who also were in the room are involved in. If you look at the CSW process, it's the, what is the commission? Yeah, the name just disappeared in my head. It's Commission on the Status of Women. Yeah. So the language that was adopted, if you look at it, is speaking on women in all their diversities. Now, and I think for the first time after so many years, you can actually pull where you can integrate and use the opportunities. And governments understand some of these languages. So I agree with you, Teshol, in saying, where are the opportunities? So opportunities are there. In the public health point of view, there's a health point of view, there's opportunities. In the education sector, there's opportunities. In the justice center, there's opportunities. So all of us must find ways to work together in solidarity, not regardless of just looking at just judiciary system, but the solidarity amongst us, and look at what is it that we're doing in terms of implementations, but also what is it that we're doing in terms of holding our governments to account, because they can't just be there and smart and look okay. We will all do that if we want to do that, right? But at the same time, it's about our own responsibility. And the last point I want to say, I do think if you look at what is happening in SADC, LGBTI persons are coming out very strongly. Being involved even in politics, being involved in taking over the spaces that were needed to have taken. We've seen the emerging political networking or organizing like Embrace Diversity. We've seen in many other countries taking shape. In Malawi, Gift Trapent, who was arrested not so long ago. So LGBTI persons are also taking up spaces politically to educate, but also politically to stand up for the constituency they represent.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. We're going to open up to the floor in 2 seconds. I think in terms of just wrapping up this particular session, and I'll come back again at the end of the Q&A from the floor, sharing of comments from the floor, to just get your sentiments around possible strategies that can be undertaken from your end in order to expand the space, and also drawing from what has been the case in the past. In looking at where we are situated currently, just briefly from your end, are we reaching a tipping point that was mentioned earlier on in the introductory speech by Neville, that we are gaining an irreversible type of momentum in advancing human rights for LGBTI persons, particularly as it relates to Southern Africa. From your different perspectives, what's your particular views on that? Are we reaching a tipping point in favor?
If I could go. We conceptualize this thing about spaces in 3 different ways. Invited, which is you get the space because you get the email to come and attend the conference or the meeting. You are invited. Those are invited spaces, and states operate on the basis of invitation, by invitation only. Yeah? Which then relates immediately to the strategy of, if you are not in the room, you're not part of the conversation. And that requires you to be able to build the alliances with those who are already in the room. All the things that Tajwal has mentioned, those things they don't not exist. Governments are complex things, and intergovernmental organizations are even more complex. So you need to then have a strategy for the invited space. And I think Steve has spoken a lot about the entry points, the possible points where you can build your case around that. Then there are the inverted spaces, right? Which is essentially where we, as those on the outside, claim the space.
Can I perhaps ask that it be a synopsis? Because we also want to give the floor an opportunity to engage.
And then the last point is what we call invented spaces. And that's the creative thing that happens when we dialogue across spaces and from different positions and entry points into SADC. So yes, there is a critical mass which has been reached, but as with anything, nothing has yet been won and nothing has been secured. And we must also strategize for what the Americans call blowback.
Thank you. Steve?
Look, I think for me, he's touched the synopsis that I was listening to. It was exactly where we were going to go as well, or I was going to go. But the point here is, it's really Liberty about how we need to look at how are we moving to address intersections in the movement. So I don't really think there's reversal of gains. That's my own opinion. I do think there's opportunities open by virtue of having allies, religious leaders who stand up and saying, I am standing up because I care, I'm standing up because lives are at stake. When you have traditional leaders who stand up, so there's no reversal of gains, but it's opportunities of allies who are joining in the movement and speaking out about human rights violation in their own spaces. So I think for me, there's almost like the open space, openness within the opportunities of engagement. And I think these are things that we need to think about for us as a movement, because probably why we say maybe there's reversal or we are not seeing more LGBTI organizations coming up, and I think the opportunities that funders create in supporting the community-based organization, it's how do we bring a collaborative effort? How do we bring a coordinated effort? We are not seeing more of coordinated efforts in our own spaces, because I think we are all spread too thin. We are all in silos in our own little corners probably, and we need to come together and saying, how do we coordinate our own efforts? But I do think we need to recognize the solidarity that is amongst us. We need to look at how many parents are speaking out, how many parents are healing. There are many initiatives that are led by community organizations, but we need to bring all this together, and you actually would see how far we have gone.
Yeah, and I think it's perhaps how do we reinvent ourselves?
Yeah.
Like, how do we know, for instance, now that we've reached a tipping point, but now, as with everything, you have to you can't use the same strategy all the time. It's like washing my hair. I can't use the same shampoo on my hair because it just doesn't work. So it's the same. You have to change it all the time. So with strategies, you have to reinvent yourself.
Yeah.
And I think the time has perhaps come for us to think about, how do we reinvent ourselves? How do we start actually without mere rhetoric of talking about intersectionality, but how do we actually do it?
Yeah.
And yeah, I thought that my hair not growing was my age. That's the shampoo. Dr. Kutso.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm looking at activists and I'm really enjoying it in the sense that as he was speaking here on my left, that my biggest frustration working for gender, in the SADC Secretariat, my first shock was when I realized that SADC was not actively engaging with civil society organization. It's one of the things that, for me, I am really paralyzed in the sense that where I had been before, both at the university, even with the UNFPA, those were the people at the grassroots that were doing actually what we were crafting in terms of policy and practice. But now, with that strategy, everything has been standstill since 2016 in Swaziland. Then now is Eswatini. Basically, what I'm saying is that, like he was pointing out, SADC works by consensus. And for the position to shift, it's very, very important that member states, they lobby, they come with, a consensus point of view to actually, cloud or overshadow those that are against. Other than that, there's very little that I can say myself in the sense that I can talk to, people like the Habibu in Botswana. We can strategize and so on and so forth, individual. But when it comes to the secretariat itself, the way we work, the way we present, first and foremost, when you come up with something, you have to present it to the senior officials who are basically directors in the member states. From there, if they agree, then it will go to the ministerial sector, whether it's gender or health or HIV and AIDS. They have to agree. When they agree, that's when they will take it to council, and from council to heads of state. So all these processes, they entail member states lobbying and cajoling and coercing and whatever word you want to use, so that at the end you get the desired results. To just look at SADC Secretariat and say SADC Secretariat is not doing this or that, it's always really, in my view, a bit misplaced. People have to know what SADC Secretariat is all about, what it's capable of doing, and what it cannot do. Even if you have 4 or 5 people who are pro-LGBTI, and then we have these others, because we are 16, 12, who are against, nothing can happen. So you need to come up with strategy of saying, how do we ensure that we build allies? How do we ensure that we come up with strategies that, will make us really, have impact? You have Pan-African, ILGA, you have so many forums that are regional that you can also try to see how they can actually assist so that you are able to permeate and be able to be seen to be doing something that is quite tangible. That is my view. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doctor. So we're going to open up to the floor to share some comments or provide some feedback. If you have questions, you can direct it to any one of the panelists up here for further clarification. So we've got 1 person over here, 2, 3.
What didn't happen in Kenya to lead to the result where decriminalization was upheld? What didn't happen that did happen in Botswana? I'm interested to hear about that, but I'm also particularly interested about the argument, because we know how the courts will take from each other. The first time I've seen it used, and I think it's the linking between marriage and decrim. So they were like, oh, we're not going to decriminalize because marriage is defined between man and woman, and if we decriminalize, we're going to open a door into legalizing marriage, so that's why we're not going to decriminalize. And that's the first time I've seen that used like by a court. How do we prepare? How do we argue against that? Because I feel like that's a very easy way out for lots of courts now to jump on the back of that judgment in terms of strategic litigation.
And that was directed at Cashwell specifically. Okay.
Yeah, McDonald Sembereka from Malawi. I want to ask, from the SADC point of view, who among our leaders is a role model, as far as moving the agenda forward is concerned? Because, as far as some of us are concerned, it's a bunch of comrades, for lack of a better word, who, if one says something, the rest will toe the same line. But in SADC currently, who can we point our fingers on and say, this one can champion our agenda? Thank you.
Thank you, McDonald. Dr. Vilakazi.
Thank you very much. My question is about the apology from the United Kingdom for colonization, right? I think we know in 2013, for the very first time after 60 years of colonization, the UK actually apologized for the torture and abuse that we experienced as former colonies. And Kenyans have taken them on, of course, to court to claim for compensation for all the torture that happened as a result of colonization. So my question is, I wonder if the trend that we're seeing in Southern Africa, because Southern African countries are largely former British colonies, whether it is that apology that is responsible for a change of mind in our leadership, and whether there is no opportunity there for us in terms of organizing and reimagining our strategies. Should we be engaging Britain more around taking responsibility after that apology to say, these are the things that have happened to us, we are dealing with the consequences of. And now that we're apologizing, what does that mean to our leadership? What does that mean to our parliaments, to our governments? Yes. Can we then say, undo, as an act of having apologized, and engage our leadership to change and remove all the penal codes? It's just a question in terms of strategy.
It's not directed at anyone in particular. Mr. Director, anyone in particular?
I'll
Anyone
take
of-
that one.
Okay. We had four at the back.
Hello? Yes. Igor Skierkwochel. It's more like a comment and question. I think it's something that I've picked up when they were going through the program, and also from the members from SADC, is that we need that political will. And it needs to start from the grassroots levels. It needs to start at your local councillor, your district councillor. I'm a councillor myself, and that's something what I'm doing in my town to create a safe space. My office is a safe space. And that's where we need to start. That political will then go up to your legislators, to your members of parliament, and you need to haunt these people because they're public servants. They need to represent us. And if that ward councillor or that district councillor do not represent us, we cannot do something. Now, I don't know, from the SADC point of view, is there an organ or an arm where we could have more public participation directly, or grassroots level public reps to get involved? Because now we have heads of states, and this is the conversation that I heard, is they work as a collective, or they're neutral on certain issues. But where we can get the grassroots level politicians to get involved so that they can hear, actually, members of my party, members of my department feel opposite from the message that I'm bringing.
It has to start there.
Linda? Oh.
Okay, firstly, I just want to point out something. I think Glenn and Joseph, we did put you in an awkward situation because you really did not respond to the question, but I understand that you work for SADC, and I would also respond in the same manner because I want to have a job when I leave here. But I'm so grateful for your input. But my question has to do with SADC. I understand the independence of, member states. And while you were talking about SADC and the independence of member states and also their inputs within SADC, I actually thought of an example of the Union of South America nations, where during the Chile incident, where students were protesting and they were voicing their own concerns about, student fees when they shut down the whole country, that union, USEN, actually did, respond, or they did actually release a statement, and they did assist the students in making sure that, the government does do something and they do react. And for a structure such as SADC, what would be the best approach for us to make sure that we do get a response from, the other nation states that seem to be, pro-decriminalization?
My name is Linda Bowman. I am from Namibia. My question goes to Tash and to Steve. And I think my question is based on the theme that we are having up there. Is there sufficient political and social will within our own community? Because when I listen to the middle speakers, they are giving us a framework of how their institutions are operating. And it's evident from our side as a movement that we haven't organized ourselves to understand how the systems are operating. And I think that's the internal question that we need to ask ourselves as we move into the next days. Are we ready? And do we really have the will and the commitment to do the transformation within and for us to go as a collective? There are regional bodies, but do we work together? Or is it individual organizations that are going into those spaces to be able to bring about change?
Okay.
Thank you very much. My name is Mama Africa from Namibia. Actually, my question is about, someone was already in the previous previous talks talking about the political will in Southern Africa and in South Africa as well, especially from the winning party side, there is much support as well. And in my country as well, from the political point of view, I'm seeing that really the winning party is really more supportive, and even our First Lady is also supportive of our issues as well. But if it comes to the opposition parties, they are silent. They are also facing so many problems from the winning parties, but they are silent, and some of the people from the LGBTI community also is from the so-called opposition parties as well. But we don't hold them accountable as well. But they are much silent. It's just the winning parties that is speaking out about our rights as well. And you know, if it comes to the fundamental human rights and freedom for LGBTI persons in SADC, you know, much work has been done so far, but I'm still wondering, especially if it comes to the colonial laws that is still existing in our countries, is that laws was made in the days of Queen Victoria and so on. But they have already decriminalized, legalized their own countries with LGBTI rights, but we have been left behind. So I'm really wondering, they have already make it free the other side, but on our side, what is so difficult to abolish that laws? Thank you.
Thank you, Mama Africa. We have about 10 minutes to run through the responses to the questions and the comments. And then, of course, if there are burning questions after, Neville, is it a question? Could we take it in the next round? Okay. So burning questions then afterwards with regards to the panelists, and then we'll conclude. So if you can bear with us for an additional 15 minutes from now, then that would be wonderful. So in terms of the questions, you want me to guide in terms of who asked the questions?
I can
No, we've
remember.
had
You can remember?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent.
The first question about Kenya, it's very difficult for me to comment on that because it's two different jurisdictions, and also as a lawyer, you cannot say why do you think the other person went wrong. But I can say what Lekabebo did, and I know with Lekabebo leading up to the case, it was very important that the framing of the stuff in the media was about the values of Botswana people. And throughout, the case was not about LGBT per se, but the frame, whenever there was a press statement that was being released, whenever there was media, it was always about that these are the values of our country. And if we believe that we are, like the Botswana has the national 2036 national vision, or they have various national documents that doesn't talk about LGBT, but it talks about the country. And whenever that was, and even in the court papers, we kept on emphasizing that Botswana is a just, caring, and compassionate nation. And if we believe in those values, then you have to decriminalize. So we tried to say to the court that we need to, the constitutional values of the country, our nation has agreed that these are our values. So by the time it came to the court, and the court heavily relied, if you read that judgment, the court constantly went back to the values. The court said that Botswana is a democratic society. They believe in diversity. Because these are all in we didn't make this up. It's all in the national documents. And so the advocacy around it was all about, it's about us as a nation. Botswana, I'm calling myself Botswana already, but I mean it's about as a society, and also the separation of powers. All the time we always try to say Kane can remember, we always, even when we were upset in the court now to postpone the matter, always said we respect the independence of the judiciary. We know that justice will prevail. Use language because we know the court read all the stuff. In fact, there was one, we definitely know that the court is reading all Legabibo's court papers. There was one press statement that we released, and we said the hearing was on the 15th of, I can't remember, the 15th of March, but it was actually we said it was on the 14th of March, but the hearing was on the 15th of March. And when the lawyer that argued the case, he was appearing, and then the judge said, oh, you guys made this mistake in your press statement. It's actually on the 15th of March. So the court is not isolated. They are part of our communities, and we need to speak a language that they understand and that they respect. We cannot go out as a movement like criticizing the judiciary, and then we still want them to rule in our favor. Because these people are not, they don't live in an island, they are humans, they have feelings, so we need to speak a language that people relate to. With regards to your question of the UK apology, I sometimes ask me if it's little too late. Because now if you use that as because this whole thing in the region about Western influence, is that the UK government trying to capture Africa again? Are they trying to now using this language by saying an apology to capture us and say now we actually have to give in to them? So we have to be careful to what extent do we want to use it as advocacy? Because it could potentially, I haven't really thought about it as much, it could potentially do more harm than good. Because decriminalization must come from Africa, and it mustn't come from the West that says, but now because I said so, that we have to decriminalize, because we suddenly decided to give an apology.
Steve, you want to look in?
Yeah. Let me touch on that because, I mean, this is work we are involved in. First, let's clarify, it's not an apology. The former Prime Minister in her quote, and this was done during the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting last year in London, and if I quote, it's deep regret. Now, English is not my mother tongue, but deep regret and apology are two different things. So while the UK regrets the colonial laws, and she specifically said they were wrong then and they are wrong now. And I think you would all understand the statement comes from two values. One, because the UK is still the current chair of the Commonwealth Heads of Government community, and they are handing over the chairpersonship to Rwanda. So you would understand Rwanda next year is hosting what we call the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. So this is also spotlight for Africa. But that deep regret was not only for colonized countries in Africa, it was where the British had colonized, and which also includes the Caribbean, the Asian Pacific, including also some of the European countries. So it's very important. So it was not an apology, it's a deep regret. Of course, there are two opinions about it, and others think, oh, it is an apology, it's not. And I think the apology process where this a government that has colonized will take a particular different shape. When a government apologizes, they will take a different shape, and where you would see immediate regress or repeal of unjust laws in that case. But in terms of regret, what the UK government had done was she made a call. And the call was the governments that would seek support for us to assist, let us know. So they were not going, and they are not going into governments as the UK to want to repeal the laws. Where governments have a will, they will assist where they can. And that's where we saw a formation of Equal Justice and Justice Alliance framework. And many of the countries have taken up that road. Botswana has taken up that call. Some of the Caribbean countries have taken up that call. So I wanted to clarify that. But I think what we've seen from those processes, there are many countries who stood up, like Ghana. A lot of people were questioning what this regret means, including Ghana, including Nigeria. In particular, in fact, even Nigeria even questioned whether the prime minister is not lesbian. For when she said that. So for us who advocate as well in the Commonwealth space, we are worried because the prime minister in the UK also have changed. So we've got the new prime minister. All of us are questioning what's going to happen. And even the route to Rwanda, what did it mean? Now, you would all know Rwanda, you have a big economic champion, and they are taking a particular shape legally, also human rights issues, and we always are skeptical in terms of what will be happening in Rwanda. And I think we need to, and I know I've raised this with Neville, possibly even with some of the development organizations, we need to think, what are the opportunities that lies with Rwanda in 2020? We've got about 18 countries in Africa who are member states of the Commonwealth. How do we continue to do that? Now, as TISEN, the Commonwealth Equality Network, we are going to be hosting an Africa Caucus in November, ahead of Rwanda. I'm looking at Linda so that she confirms I know I'm speaking the right details. And I'm hoping that we can use the opportunity to engage further on how do we broaden the scope, particularly for countries that are involved. Why? The initial meeting was not going to take place in Rwanda. The initial meeting was going to take place in Malaysia, but because Malaysia has got political instability and dynamics happening there, it was moved to Rwanda. We don't know whether Chokwe will be coming back anytime soon in Africa. So there's a spotlight on that. There was a question, I don't know if I want to answer the question of role model, I'll leave it to you. But what I wanted to say, South Africa will be taking a chairmanship of AU this year. It's very important to look at that role. That's number one. Two, South Africa will be taking again the chairmanship in the Human Rights Security Council. Sorry, the Security Council, the UN Security Council. Now, in the case where the world is discussing what we call peace and security, and we know because we've got resolution 1325, which is women, peace, and security. Now, we have been discussing in terms of what is our role and how do we participate and how do we make sure the peace and security is not just out of context. What does it mean for us? So we need to think about that. I do think we can play a role. I don't know if we want to speak about who are the role models in South Africa, but there are few people who have political will that we can start to engage, talk to, and start to advance the agenda, particularly because of the role that will be played. And very lastly, there's the champions. Now, these are former heads of states, and I'm raising this because we do quite a lot of work with the champions, and now recently some of the colleagues who are around the room will be joining a meeting in Kenya in 2 weeks' time with the former heads of states. I respect the former heads of states because as much as they were established to look at just HIV at that point, but they have now since integrated leaving no one behind. And they are advocating as the former heads of states in Africa, engaging the current heads of states in terms of how do we advance and not leaving anyone behind. Now, the current chair of the champions is President Mogai. He will be stepping down, and I know I'm not allowed to say this, he will be stepping down in the near future. But one of the most important things about President Mogai, who was the head of state from Botswana, about 10 years ago when I used to work for OSISA, we used to have the BBC dialogues. You know, he was asked a question during the dialogues. Oh, but when you were president, why didn't you change the law? Yes. And he was honest in his response, and he said, oh, you wanted me to lose votes, right? And he further said, well, again, in my country, when I was the head of state, no one was harassed, no one was sanctioned in any way. And I think it's very important to think about the situation where DCRIM it's not in place, where it is still illegal to be us, what are the work or kind of works and interventions are taking place to make sure their lives are not at stake? Now, President Mogae this year spoke in Cape Town. Danilo was there. Stood during his remarks and he says, I regret not changing the laws during my term in office, and I want to apologize. Yes. For me, I think it's very important for somebody, if you are talking about what political will means, if you don't see a change in an individual, you must ask yourself whether you're doing enough. Because I think we really also must admit, as LGBTI community, do we want to just bash or ban against the wall with individuals who are not changing? Or do we want to work with individuals who are changing along the way, that as part of the solidarity? And I think this links to Linda's point, where she's asking whether, are we really seeing that political will? I do think there's quite a lot of people we are not tapping on who are changing along the way. And because as a movement, and it's very important, the movement, whether you're asking whether the movement is ready, I don't know. I don't think so, because there's quite a lot of people who do not want to engage government. We want change, but we do not want to engage government. Where would that change happen? So we can't do the same thing and expect different results. So if you want to just advocate in the streets, but you want policy to change, who makes that change if you're not part of it? So I do think it's very important. The movement needs to reflect internally. And I think few of the organizations and probably few of the individuals who are moving forward.
Apologies, I've been
Yes,
cautioned.
but I'll end with this sentence because it's important for us as a movement. Those are the people and organizations that have made conscious decision. And I know, and I'm putting this, and I might be opening myself to vulnerability here. We have made this conscious decision because it was, at that moment, it mattered. That we move to engage and to hold our state accountable, but to walk the journey together. And I think the movement needs to reflect on that importantly, and not just push people away because of association.
Perhaps just in addition to that, also noting who is the movement, in what context must the movement adopt, which type of approach that's going to be relevant in responding to the needs in that particular instance as well. In going to yourself, Joseph, in terms of some of the questions that were lodged earlier on, and there were one that was particularly relevant, and I think also to you, Glenn, around participation of political leaders at SADC level, but I also think it alluded to participation of community-based activists as well and leaders.
Really, I do not want to waste people's time because I think Steve has covered some of the things that I had here, even the story of Mogae. But what I would like to address is that it's very important to know how the SADC Secretariat works. Because you know, we have, of course, the regional indicative strategic plan, and then we would have even the strategy on politics and affairs, like you were saying. And then we have committee of ministers who meet. And this is where, in most cases, people, when they want change, they get the entry. I'll give an example. Just in the last meeting of the Ministers responsible for gender and women affairs in Namibia, a minister from Zimbabwe just proposed as a decision that SADC should actually elevate the issue of sanctions, that it's affecting women and children, and therefore it's no longer about just politics or punishing the leaders who are supposed to be the vanguard of oppression and so on and so forth, but to cascade it to the people. And it was documented in the decision that the ministers took as ministers of gender and women's affairs. They took it to council, and council took it to summit, and they have even agreed on the date that all SADC member states will be demonstrating against sanctions in Zimbabwe. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that, for instance, for this particular case, and South Africa, I should also spell out that when it comes to contribution in SADC, is the largest contributor financially and otherwise. So if South Africa right now, you lobby them, and they are to propose to one of these statutory meetings that this is the decision that you want us to take, and so on and so forth, and they are in the forefront, I don't see anything stopping them from doing that. So there's an entry that is very, very easy. You suggest the decision, if 2 or 3 agree, it becomes binding, and then as to whether after being documented, it will be implemented, that's another story. But basically, this is how things work. We work according to the strategies that are there, and also the statutory decisions that are taken by ministers when they meet all the time. Steve was part of the sexual and reproductive health revision of the strategy of SADC, and there were countries like, for instance, Tanzania, that were a bit uncomfortable with certain, concepts and so on and so forth. Even the issue of family planning now is all of a sudden not acceptable, and I could not understand why. So it was through coercion and also a negotiation that no. But this strategy, we wanted to be sexual and reproductive health rights, and we are taking this decision. And ministers, unanimously agreed. Of course, Tanzania said we are reserving, we have a reservation on this one, and so on and so forth. So even for this particular issue on LGBTI, this is what actually South Africa can propose, and those that are not comfortable, they will reserve. But at the end of the day, it becomes a SADC, decision, and then maybe member states can start running with it. That is what I can say for now.
Thank you.
Okay, I want to be very brief because I think time is against us. So firstly, just to clarify, when I grow up, I will work for SADC. I don't work for SADC. They have an office, we have an office. Yeah, the two organizations recognize each other. We are an NGO, like most of you. So just to be clear, but we have the privilege of being invited to many of these spaces. So on that clarification, somebody asked the question about who amongst the current crop of leaders is useful. I would say Geinkop. Sorry, I'm not going to do all the protocol stuff. Just call them out. Masisi, CR, and Nyosi. So that's Mozambique, Namibia, Botswana, South Africa, and I would add ED to that list, Manangagwa. I know, but it links it links strangely to your question about this apology, non-apology. He needs to put distance between himself and, all of that, and there's an economic incentive for rapprochement, So I would actually say to you, because I said to you at the very beginning, an organization like ZANU-PF is actually neutral on this question. So with an economic incentive and the right language and the right approach, you can move them, I think, on this. And that would be massive, absolutely massive. But that comes to the point of coordination. It's a very, very serious problem. The RISDP, I know we're going to throw around lots of acronyms here which will confuse you, but I think it would be very useful from the previous work that has been done to share as much about SADC with you as possible, so that you understand how this this animal works or doesn't work, so that we can have concrete conversations about the entry point. I think those are the things where you can map these things more usefully. So there is, at the moment, there has been for several years, a non-state actor mechanism that is on the table. It's now gone back to member states. That means gone back to your countries for consultation. Please be part of those conversations. Please put yourselves forward into that. More importantly, the RISDP and CIPO are under review, have been under review for a while, but there's an opportunity to comment on the document, right, which will take forward, and that deadline is the end of October. So what I would ask, what would really be helpful is if from our side we know where the contact point is that isn't exclusive but is inclusive. Who do we communicate with to say, SADC wants mediators from communities? Surely you have that capacity here. There are issues around health and other things. There's the Regional Poverty Observatory. All of these institutions many, many opportunities. The rule of law space, they've opened it up for the first time. We're sitting with them as civil society, with some key allies. Be part of the conversation, but it becomes very difficult if we don't have a coordination point, which we know is legitimate, is accepted as the coordination point, so that we don't compete, but we come aside, I think, the last word.
Thank you. And I do know, are you okay, Neville? Because we are quite over time at this point in time. Just want to thank the four panelists for taking time out to share your rich knowledge and wisdom and experience and understanding of complex issues that we are faced with as a community. And I think that would be a gesture of thanks from the other foundation. And hopefully we'll be able to explore some of the possibilities and opportunities that have flowed from this particular discussion throughout the conference, but also in practice as it relates to the work outside of the kopano space as a whole. So once again, thank you so much, and thank you for being an incredible audience. I hope that you enjoy lunch.